Chapter 29, Darkness in Light Hall in the Green Ember. Every time Heather tried to speak, Mrs. Weaver gave her a discouraging look, while Pickett gushed about being pelted with stones, hit in the face, whipped with a jacket, insulted with names like Ladybug. Mrs. Weaver just sat there nodding. It was fantastic, Pickett said, for what felt to Heather like the 15th time. It sounds lovely, Mrs. Weaver said. I especially enjoyed the part where he kicked dirt in your eyes. If only, Heather blurted out, he could have killed you. Then we'd throw a party. She was angry and tired of holding it in. Mrs. Weaver shook her head. Pickett, she said, will you excuse us, my boy? Perhaps ask Emma to take a look at your eye and your foot and, well, everything. She laughed, and Pickett did too. You'll need to be ready for more of the same tomorrow. Heather's eyes bulged, but Mrs. Weaver gave her an authoritative gesture to be quiet. Thank you, Mrs. Weaver, Pickett said, getting to his feet again. Thank you so much, he said apologetically, and then he smiled and limped off. When he was gone, Mrs. Weaver smiled at Heather. You must let him be who he is, Heather, and you must let him become what he will become. Like Helmer, she said. No, dear, like Pickett. When Heather finally made it down to dinner an hour later, she found Emma, Pickett, and Hayward sitting down to eat. We waited for you, Pickett said, his mouth full. Thanks, she said. You're here laughing up a storm with a gang of friends, smiling like you found a lost treasure, and I'm stomping around getting lectures about correcting my attitude. She threw her hands up. Did someone throw the world in reverse today? Everyone laughed, even Pickett. Pickett laughed. This showed her she'd been wrong somehow and that Mrs. Weaver was right. Pickett felt a spark in her heart as she saw a small glimmer of the old Pickett, maybe even the new Pickett. Maggie Osage, she thought, how well she has earned that name. Pickett went to get some soup, a delicious-smelling mix of parsley, potatoes, and broccoli. She was still angry at Helmer and mistrustful of his motives and tactics, but she had other things to worry about now, and she knew at least some answers could come in a few hours at the initiation. She sat down to eat with her friends, thankful to have them. She laughed with them as Pickett told all about calling Helmer Master Child and Wasp, and all about his day of training. Emma had early apprenticeship tales of Dr. Zeiger's strange language and confusing orders. Hayward talked of a new method for calculating the straight edge and how it would only take him 6 months to build and how he'd saved half the coins to buy the supplies. Everyone laughed, and after a moment, Hayward joined them. Heather relaxed. For the moment, she almost forgot about her absent father's honor, her brother's crazy mentor, her own crippling fear of doing what she felt inspired to do, the deadly, dangerous world, and all the horrible mysteries surrounding her like an evil army in the dark. Almost. Her smile was real, but a labyrinth lay behind it. It was dark. Heather and Pickett walked through King Whitson's garden and up to the front door of Light Hall. Pickett was still limping a little. The garden was as lovely at night as it was in the daytime. The moonlight added a glow to everything, making the garden all blues and blacks with a silver glint. Heather was heavy-hearted while Pickett was smiling. She hadn't felt like she should burden Pickett with what she had overheard earlier, especially on a day when he was happy, the only day he'd been at all happy since their adventure began. Heather knocked. After a few moments, Lord Rake opened the door and beckoned the two to come in. They came through a dim, narrow hallway that ended in light. Heather walked, head down, behind Pickett. She bumped into her brother. Pickett, she said, annoyed, looking up at him. As she raised her head, she saw what was causing him to stop. The room was lovely, both serious and arresting. It was round, wood-walled, but set by stunning multicolored glass scenes of incredible height. Heather gaped, walked forward, and slowly spun around, trying to take it all in. She imagined it must be breathtaking bursts of light in the daytime. Here in the moonlight, the scenes were duller, more subdued, but still beautiful. She walked around silently, reverently. Here was a place to think, to be humble. She read 1,000 calls to awe in that room before she knew anything about why it existed. She gazed at the high ceiling, the carefully carved wooden walls, and the bright, gigantic windows of colored glass. She walked to the middle of the room where Lord Rake stood alongside Uncle Wilfred. She spun again slowly and tried to take it all in. The colored windows were pictures, clear and fine. There were scenes of war, of armies colliding, of single combat. There were characters, most notably a tall brown rabbit with a crown glittering in the sunlight and a burnished blade in his hands. Heather noticed that these windows were stories, and each told a story about an event. There were 8. A huge cloth covered 2 others, Glazier's supplies neatly stacked on the floor beneath the 10th. Was it incomplete? Heather was already thinking of it as the room of 10 tales, 10 windows, but each window had several scenes, so each was a complex story. "It's King Jupiter, isn't it?" she asked, pointing to a window made up mostly of red. It featured a beaten wolf and the heroic rabbit descending on him with his death-dealing sword as the red sun set behind them. "Yes," Uncle Wilfred said, his voice a little hoarse. "It's the king." "Garlics?" Pickett asked as they looked at the wolf. Uncle Wilfred nodded. "I understand you came across his son Red-Eye," Lord Rake said. They nodded. "It's a deadly ally of Morbin Blackhawk. That must have been frightening." "It was," Heather said, glancing around at the many windows all around the room. She caught Pickett's eye, and he looked down. The old gloom was settling over him again. Is that all it takes, she thought? One mention of the awful day by 7 mounds in Nick Hollow, and he's back to brooding. The several scenes included in the 8 visible windows each featured a central image in the round, with related images above and below. The shape of each mural was the same, tall rectangles with a bulging circle in the center, bursting past the rectangular confines. King Jupiter's triumph over Garlics made the final scene. It was featured in the center, large and plain, the 2 combatants and a red sunset. But the images above and below were of other heroic rabbits, of other allies, of fights with wolves, and one of what looked like rabbits signing a document at a table. Heather, with a shock, noticed a gray rabbit at the table beside the king. "Who's the gray rabbit?" she asked, trembling. "That's part of what you're here to learn, my dear," Lord Rake said. Uncle Wilfred tried to smile, but he looked down. She looked from window to window, noticing the gray rabbit in many scenes. The 8th window's central image featured the gray rabbit with the king side by side, looking out over a vast land. At their feet were broken swords and spears, shattered bows, and cast-off shields. Before them were plowed fields, children at play, works of art, rabbits working. "It's a vision of peace," Lord Rake said, smiling regretfully at the image. "It's one we've tried to recapture here in this community." "It's a lie," Uncle Wilfred said sadly. Lord Rake said nothing, but only hung his head. "What happened?" Heather said, unable to keep the question inside any longer. "Please tell us what happened." Uncle Wilfred looked up at the image of the gray rabbit with King Jupiter, shook his head sadly, then turned to face Heather and Pickett. "Our family betrayed the king." I'm going to stop now, but you're going to love the title of the next chapter. It's called The Green Ember.